Welcome to Grief is the New Normal. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, a licensed psychologist and grief specialist, here to help change the conversation about grief and build community and connection while we all adjust to this new normal we are living in. This podcast is for you if you are grieving or if you are supporting someone in a season of grief. I'm glad you're here. Hey friends, welcome back to Grief is the New Normal. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, grief psychologist, and today we're talking about something that doesn't get enough space in grief conversations. What happens when loss makes you feel like you've lost yourself too? Because here's the thing, grief doesn't just take the person you lost, it can take your sense of identity, your routines, your motivation, your ability to even recognize yourself in the mirror. Maybe you felt, I don't even know who I am anymore. I don't recognize myself in this version of my life. The things that used to bring me joy don't even feel good anymore. So if any of that sounds familiar, you're not alone. Today, we're going to unpack why grief shakes your sense of identity, how to navigate the uncomfortable feeling of, I don't know who I am anymore, and ways to reconnect with yourself when everything feels unfamiliar. So this one is for anyone and everyone who feels like they've lost more than just their person. So let's get into it. So you know what people don't warn you about with grief? When you lose someone or something that was part of how you saw yourself, it doesn't just hurt. It completely upends your identity, because grief isn't just about missing them. It's about missing who you were when they were here. And sometimes that loss feels so big, so overwhelming that you start to wonder, who the heck am I now? So let's talk about why that happens. One, grief disrupts your roles. Roles, ROLES. If you were a caregiver, a spouse, a sibling, a best friend, when that person is gone, so is that version of you. And when I say that, I'm not saying you're not a spouse anymore, you're not a sibling anymore, you're not a best friend anymore. I'm not saying that, but there's a break, there's a disruption in that concept of self. So you're always a sibling, you will always be a best friend, you will always be a spouse. And there's a break, a disruption in that self-concept. Another thing to think about is your daily life changes. Maybe your routines revolved around them. Maybe your social world was tied to them. Maybe the life you pictured included them, and now it doesn't. And that sucks. These secondary losses that happen, the ripples from that primary loss event, are connected to this impact on our daily life and the routines, the communication, the doing life together stuff. It gets thrown off course. It's almost like you were on this train track moving forward, headed in one direction, and this loss happens, and it's like you skip tracks, and suddenly you're on this parallel track, and it's moving slower, it's moving in a different direction, but it's still like pacing with that original track. It just, the experiences you're having on it are different, and they're missing something. Another piece is the things that you used to enjoy might feel meaningless. Hobbies, routines, passions, it all feels distant and maybe even a little pointless. And that's hard, right? We want to do the things that feel good. We don't like change. We like what's familiar. And being in a space where you're not enjoying the things that were life-giving, that brought comfort, that's hard and uncomfortable and confusing and overwhelming. And there's fear there, because it's, am I ever going to get back to that? Am I ever going to enjoy those things again? And with grief, there isn't really a going back. We can't go back to who we were before the loss. We learn how to navigate it and carry it with us in a different way as we figure out what the new normal is. And still, it can be really disorienting and feel like that what the heck, what's the point here? So something to think about. And then lastly, here in talking about what happens is there's this concept of mirror neurons, where when we are with someone, it's like our brains are mirroring back at them. This is very basic language here. There's better scientific language, but for the point of communicating concepts, this is what I got. And, these mirror neurons form when we are with these people. And so if we've lost someone really close to us who does a lot of life with us, we can't access those mirror neurons in the same way anymore because we don't have that person to reflect that part of ourselves back at us. And there's grief there because our brain is looking for them, looking for that mirror, that connection, that reflection of self, and it's not here anymore. And that's super disorienting. And then one of the hardest things about grief is you're looking around at a world that's moving forward while you feel stuck. So back to that metaphor of jumping train tracks, right? You've hopped tracks, but your train hasn't figured out the go button yet. It hasn't figured out how to move. And so you're just stuck, disoriented. How did I get here? Where am I going now? What does this look like? On a train track you didn't ask to be on, and you don't even know how to get it moving because you're just overwhelmed by all that's going on. Story time with Heather. Whew. I relate to this topic very deeply. Who I was before my brother died is very different than who I became and grew into in working through my grief and understanding loss. And it absolutely changed me. I didn't relate in the same way. I talk about this a lot with clients where it's almost like when you go through a loss, you learn how to speak a new language, and you can't really understand how to speak that language until you've been through a loss experience, a grief experience, that level of pain from a death. And that's how I felt. I felt so out of sync with my peers, with a lot of my friends. And I felt so different, especially in my family system, not with my parents. They were in the dark space with me too, but like even my cousins who, yes, they loved my brother. They were close to him too. They had gone through the grief with me, but their grief looked really different. They hadn't lost a sibling. They lost a cousin. And not trying to compare loss here. It was different. They still had all of their siblings. They still have all of their siblings. And I'm the only one who hasn't. And so it felt othered and different in ways that I wasn't expecting. And so I felt and have felt different existing in this world without a sibling. And that's been hard and tricky and different kinds of grief that I've had to keep navigating through. And yeah, there's my story for today. So we're going to pivot a little bit in talking about shifts in identity with grief. And I need to say something that's really important, and I already was alluding to it, and we're just going to say it. Grief is a transformation process. And like all transformations, it's messy. And sometimes these transformations happen whether we want them to or not. We're experiencing a death-related loss. We didn't ask to be here. We didn't ask for this to happen. We're in it. We're here. And it's changing us. And sometimes it changes us for the better. Sometimes it changes us because it just changes us. And let's talk about how that happens, right? Because the truth is you are not the same person that you were before your loss. And that's not a failure. It's just a reality, because here's what's happening. Our nervous systems are rewiring themselves. Grief is trauma to our brains. The way we see the world, the way we process emotions, it's all shifting. All of those concepts of self are shifting in our brains. Our relationships are shifting too. Some people step up, some disappear, and some don't know what to do with this new version of us, that maybe we have limited bullshit tolerance. We don't talk about frivolities anymore. We are deep thinkers, deep feelers. Maybe we make lifestyle choice changes. We're changed. I think back to that time, and I had a new friend. At the time, I'd only met her maybe 6 weeks before my brother died. And we were part of a community group thing for young adults. And I shared with the gals that my brother had died, and one of them reached out and let me know that a mom figure for her had died 3 days before Garrett did. And she was my grief buddy. Like, I felt such a deep connection with her because we spoke this language that others in our community group didn't. And we went through Dark December together, and she has remained one of my closest friends 15 years later, because that grief connection, that feeling seen in a way that some of my other friends didn't know how to, or couldn't know how to, or chose not to, it changed us, and it changed our friendship and its trajectory, because relationships shift when we're grieving too. And another thing to think about is you're adjusting to a world that doesn't include your person. And that changes how we interact with everything, from the way we make decisions to what we believe about the future to who we believe ourselves to be. All of that is shifting as we adjust to the new normal, the new landscape of the world without our person physically here. And let me be clear, this, and I even said this earlier, this is not about getting back to who you were, because honestly, that version of you doesn't exist anymore. And I know that's hard and uncomfortable to sit with. And you're still here. Even if you don't know what that means yet, you're still here. And it's okay to not know what that means yet. Because if you've been waiting to feel like yourself again and it hasn't happened, I need you to hear this. You're not going back. That doesn't mean you're lost forever. That doesn't mean you're not going to find your way through. And it's important to remember, like, grief isn't something to get over, it's something to get through as we learn to carry it in new and different ways, which means we're getting to know ourselves in new and different ways. So let's talk about what it feels like when we don't recognize ourselves anymore. Because while you can't force yourself back into an old identity, you can start building a relationship with the version of you that exists now. So here's how to get started. First, we need to acknowledge the shift. Stop waiting to, quote unquote, go back to who you were. You're going to be waiting a long time. You're going to be trying to force a square peg into a round hole. Like, it's not going to work. So instead, ask yourself, who am I now in this moment? You don't need to think about 10 steps from now, a year from now. In this moment, who am I now? What are those pieces of me, those identifiers, those roles and labels that I claim for myself in this moment? Asking yourself, what still feels true about me, even in grief? And for me, a big thing that felt very true in my grief is I was still a sister. Even though my brother's not physically here anymore, I am still a sister. And that has been and will continue to be an important thing for me to claim. And then asking yourself, what no longer fits? Part A, and then part B. And am I okay with that? And asking yourself that not because you need to be okay with it, because you don't, but just giving yourself permission to name that, okay, this piece no longer fits and I'm okay with that, or this piece no longer fits and I'm not okay with that. So you're giving yourself permission to feel what you feel with however that's showing up. Those are just some acknowledgments to ask yourself just to get started. Number 2, start small with things that feel familiar. You're not trying to fix anything. Like, you don't have to totally understand yourself overnight. Instead, try engaging with small things that reconnect you to parts of yourself. Maybe it's a song that used to make you feel something, good, bad, or ugly. Maybe a walk in a place that used to make you feel grounding. I grew up in Pacific Northwest. There's this really wonderful wetlands trail near where I grew up, and I went for walks there, remembering how I'd felt in other seasons of life while walking there. We grew up going on walks there as a family. I would run there when training for sports growing up. I'd go on walks there with friends. I'd go there to cry. This was a very familiar trail. And so when Gare died, it was like, okay, I'm going to go walk the wetlands and just notice how I feel there, because that was such a familiar space that I used to process a lot of feelings. Okay. And then another small thing to do, wear something that feels like you. So for me, even before I was a therapist, I was a sweater, scarf kind of gal. I really like accessories. And in those early grieving days, I existed in loungewear or Gare's sweatshirts. I would wear he had this one sweatshirt that I really loved. Wearing something that felt like me. It took a while to get there, and it almost felt like armor that I was putting on, trying to anchor myself to who I thought I was, who I used to be, and that felt comforting and familiar. What was tricky for me too is some of the clothing I used to have was really activating. I don't know if I've shared this story on here. Maybe I have. I don't know. We're a lot of episodes in, so I don't remember all the stories. Anyways, I had a very colorful wardrobe. I like a lot of personality in my clothing. Didn't wear a lot of brands, like to thrift things. So there was a lot of funky pieces in my wardrobe. And I feel like I need to preface that context for this story. So the morning that Garrett died, I woke up and was like, today feels like a day for sequins. Literally, I don't think I've ever had that thought before, but that's how I felt that morning. And so I had this funky little dress that had sequins on it. And so I wore it over a t-shirt and jeans because it was 2009 and that's what we did. We wore dresses over jeans and that's what I planned to wear to work. And I felt good in it. And then a few hours later, I got the news Garrett died and was like, what the heck is wrong with my brain that I woke up thinking today was a day for sequins? And after that first year, it was like I tried to reclaim what sequins meant. And anyways, sometimes clothing might feel activating because it also reminds you of other things. So again, these are just examples. These are not the perfect solutions for what to do, but it's trying to start small, and clothing, walks, music, those are things that can feel small. And then lastly, being open to new parts of yourself. Sometimes grief clears the way for new parts of your identity to emerge. You might find that you want different things, need different people, or value life in a different way. And that gets to be okay. You are allowed to change. You are allowed to let your grief change you and change what feels important and what you pursue in this world. So our little weekly call out, right? Not everyone is going to get this. It is not going to make sense to everyone. There will be people in your life who just expect you to get back to normal, who get frustrated when you don't do things like you used to, who say things like you're not yourself anymore, as if it's a bad thing. And here's what I want you to remember. You are not responsible for making other people comfortable with your grief or with who you are post-loss. You are allowed to change. You are allowed to outgrow relationships. You are allowed to become someone new without apologizing for it. No sorries. Sorry, I'm different. No. Let it go. Let that shit go. Okay. Wrapping up today's episode, grief doesn't just change your life. It changes you. And you are not going back or getting back. You're still here. You are in this new normal, adjusting to this new space. And it's okay to feel lost. It's okay to take your time to figure out who you are now. And you do not owe anyone an explanation for the ways you are changing and for grieving. So if this episode resonated with you, I want you to sit with one question this week. What is one small thing I can do to reconnect with myself just as I am today? If you want to share your thoughts, feel free to DM me on Instagram at Grief is the New Normal. I'd love to hear how this episode lands with you. It's okay to make your own rules here for what feels right for you. Remember to be kind to yourselves today and take care. I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for tuning in. That's it for today's episode of Grief is the New Normal. If this conversation resonated with you or you think it might benefit someone else, please share it. Sharing can open doors to healing, understanding, and normalizing these griefy conversations. If you're craving deeper insights or ongoing support, consider signing up for the Grief Gap newsletter. It's packed with resources, tips, and personal stories to help you navigate your grief journey. Visit the website www.griefisthenewnormal.com to subscribe. For those who prefer a more personal touch to their healing process, check out my grief journal, Authentically Unapologetic. It's designed to help you explore your grief on your own terms with prompts and exercises that encourage reflection and growth. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, and I look forward to our next meaningful conversation. Our soothing tunes are provided by the Datacorns. If you're interested in sharing your story, collaborating, or learning more, please email me at hello@griefisthenewnormal.com. You can also stream the episodes on YouTube for more engaging content. Until next time, keep exploring your grief with intention and support, remembering you don't have to do this alone.